In this video, we're going to talk about some of your options for displaying images when you're building a Power BI report. I've helped several people recently do different scenarios with this, and I thought I'd just sort of put together one video that talks through all your options and maybe cover a few scenarios in one shot. Before I get started, I want to give a shout out to some of the places where I found some tricks that I'll show in the videos today. One is this article by Chris Webb talking about storing large images in Power BI datasets. This one is really useful. Patrick LeBlanc on GuineCube also had I'll use one of these, this little trick that he shows for SharePoint Online images that covers one scenario. And then I also show something with Deneb as well. And Kerry Kolosko's got some great content on that front. And I used one of the tips from this article to cover one of the scenarios as well. Right. So the images are natively supported, with several of the visuals. And the simplest use case is just to have an image URL as a column in your data and then use one of the native visuals. So if this meets your needs, great. The table, the matrix, the multi-row card, and the slicer visuals all support images. And in this case, I'm just using a simple table that just has 4 pictures that I found somewhere online that were free to use. And I just have the URLs to those images loaded into the data model. And, if you were to just take these URLs, put them in a web browser, you would see just the picture, and there's no authentication needed. These are just anonymous images from an authentication standpoint. All right, so again, if this meets your needs, great. Now you might say, well, we do have some images, but they're confidential to our company and we have them stored internally. And so one place you may store them is on SharePoint. And that's where this is the tip from Patrick's video that you can, in your Power Query, go to your SharePoint document library where your files are stored, for example, and construct the URL from 2 of the fields that are available there. You can use the folder path and concatenate that with the name of the file, for example, and generate the full image URL, and then load that to your data model. Key with this, as well as the other one I showed with the native visuals, I forgot to mention that whenever you have a URL field, you need to categorize it as an image URL so Power BI knows to go out and get that image and display it as an image. So in this case with SharePoint, you see these broken links here, and you can watch Patrick's video. But basically, the nice thing to know is even though it's broken here in my local Power BI desktop file, when I do publish that up to the service, and if I look here, here's where my 4 images are stored on my SharePoint site, and then here's my published report. Right, so that's great to know that even though it looks like you may be stuck in Power BI desktop, you aren't. All right, so that's SharePoint. Another scenario is, I don't want to deal with connecting to them live in a web location. I'd like to just load the content of the image file actually into the model, and that's a great technique as well. And so you can actually load the data to the model. If we go back to the query editor and we do this base 64 one, this is a common approach here where you would, connect to your source, filter it to, just your images, for example. You only need to keep your file name and then the content of the file. And then you can add a custom column like this, where you basically use binary to text function. On your content column, you need to tell it that the binary file is base64 encoded. You add this prefix to the front of it. You can also do it with /PNG as well. And then basically load this to your data. You can get rid of the content file. After that, load this, categorize it as image URL, and then treat it like a URL, and you'll see your image there. If we go back to the port, you can see your images show up here. Now, one of the limitations you'll run into is there's a character limit around 32,000 something on how many characters you can have in that text string. And obviously, I'm not showing the whole image here, so clearly these images were a little bit too big. So if they're really small, this approach may work fine for you. But if they're bigger, there is a different approach you can use. And you can actually break the text string into segments. And this is where the Chris Webb article is really useful. And he shows a technique in there to break it into lengths of 30,000 and then actually reconstruct the image with a measure to get your full image loaded, as shown here. So if I go back over to the query editor here, I call this one base 64 segments. And if we go through just like before, I get to my file and my binary, and now I add a little bit more complex function here. I won't go through this whole thing because we'll see it in the next steps. Basically, what this does, I used a little bit different approach than Chris did here, and there's other ones you could do as well. But basically, in this first variable, generating that text string binary to text just like before. Then I have a step here where I'm getting the length of that and dividing it by 30,000 because I'm going to break it into 30,000 chunks. So I need to know how many chunks I end up with. And then I round that up so I have an integer. Then there's this splitter text by repeated lengths, and I can specify a length of 30,000. This is the one I got from Chris's article. And then apply that to the image text variable, and I get a list of up to 30,000 character long segments from the image. And then I just do a trick here where I create a list of 1 to however many segments I need, and I zip that list, so combine that with this image split list, and then create a record for that, which I'll expand in the next steps, and that's what I create in the custom column. So once I create that, I can expand that list column. That shows me a record, and you see that each image now has multiple rows. This one was 2, this one was 3, 3, and 2. And if you look inside each of these records, you can see the text segment as well as the order, so that when we put it back together, we can put it back into the same order and get the correct image. Then expand that out. So for every image now, there's multiple rows, but I have an order column and then the text segment as well. All right. And then the last step for this approach is to create a measure. So in this case, I have this concat segments measure here. And so the key to this one, is to use, first you want to make sure you're only trying to view one image at a time. So it's good to wrap this or have an if with has one value to make sure that I'm only processing one file at a time. Again, we put our prefix here. We're going to categorize this measure as an image URL as well. And then we use concatenate X, where I iterate over that table. Since I have one value, it'll only be the rows for that one image. And then I'm going to concatenate those image segments together with no delimiter. And then I'm going to use this order column ascending as the order in which they should be concatenated. And as you can see, you get the full image back. And then the one person I was helping recently, they were like, yeah, this is all good if I had a table of images, but I really just want to show one image at a time on my report. Say I'm only looking at one salesperson's results, for example, or one data for one leader part of the organization, for example. So we worked through that, and so there's some good options for that. Like the table or matrix, it might be hard to get it so that, like the headers were gone and that kind of stuff. So the multi-row card can work well for that option, just to display one at a time. And the chiclet slicer is another good option that works with images, multiple or single. And I have it shown 3 different ways here where I've got the external URL I've got the one where I have one row of text data for the image loaded into the model. But unfortunately, the chiclet slicer didn't work with the concatenate X measure version of that. I'm not able to drop a measure into this image field here. Okay, so that is a limitation on that. So one last thing I'll show here is, of course, I'm a big fan of the Deneb visual, and you can, of course, also use Deneb for images as well for most scenarios. I have it here, just sort of using my name as my Y encoding, and then using the image, the concatenate X measure as the value there. I'll show that in this next one here, and it also works well for a single image as well. And if I just go in to look at the spec for this, the JSON, you can see that pretty simple. I can play with the image size here, and then I just, in the encoding, you have to encode the URL, and in that case, in this visual, I just have the name field, and then I have that segments, that concatenate X measure as well, and it renders fine. And because there's a filter from another slicer on this visual, I'm only displaying one here, and I get the result I'm looking for. And you could also play with the padding and things and really get it down to just the image as well. I didn't do that here, but there's more flexibility available. So this one actually doesn't work with just the straight URL, so that is a limitation to be aware of. So hopefully, having all these tips in one place could be a good resource for folks that are trying to display images in their report.